and welcome to the Empty Chair. My name is Previn Karian. This video is a part two to understanding Freud's model of mind based on sadism in misogyny. I wanted to develop the application of sadistic misogyny a little bit more rather than the very general statements that I was making previously. My disclaimer again is to remind you that I'm not talking about all of heterosexual men's psychology all of the time, but just focusing on our shadow, which lives in our unconscious space. And the genius of Freud as well as of Carl Jung is that they explored their own unconscious to come up with some working models which I was able to use for 22 years in my psychotherapy practice. It's very hard to present all that knowledge in just a few videos, so I hope you can be patient with the way I'm trying to break it all down. Another disclaimer is the trigger warning that I will be talking about some distressing examples of sadistic misogyny. So please stop the video if you find the contents too upsetting. Just to give you an overview, a full explanation of sadistic and masochistic misogyny would have to work through a minimum of 3 key texts of Freud. Now, if you're in the mood or have the inclination, please feel free to read these yourself. I'll just briefly run through them here. Freud spent his lifetime developing his model of mind. His 3 essays on sexuality posited sadism and masochism as drives, while instincts and their vicissitudes made the observation that instinctual drives were connected to psychologically formed objects in our minds. And these mental objects, or image constellations, changed over time. For example, according to the model in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, when we are baby infants, the first woman that we love in our lives is our mother. And the first man that we love in our lives is our father. They become psychological objects in our minds. We learn about who we are through our relationship with these primary figures. It's a process that Donald Winnicott called psychological mirroring. Over time, for heterosexual men, the object of our maternal love is transferred to girls and women that we find attractive enough to commit to a relationship with them. So psychologically, the object of love has transformed and morphed as we grow into our teenage and young adult years. But these transformed relationships still carry the residues of our relationship with our mothers. So they are psychological residues that stay with us in all our relationships. Likewise, the love of our fathers is transferred over time to figures of authority and role models. The heterosexual men have a need to admire, follow, and obey in order to develop our sense of masculinity. As heterosexual boys grow up, the object of paternal love transforms into social identifications, but again contains the residues of our earlier relationship with our fathers. Now, of course, there are numerous variables to this which are worked out in depth in psychoanalytic psychotherapy in terms of the absence or the presence of our fathers and the way in which they were absent or present. So Freud's model of mind claims that our drives connect with psychological objects which can change over time, but will retain its primary residues. And that was broadly his realization in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. But a really key text in understanding sadism and sadistic misogyny is his paper called Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920. After meeting a female psychoanalyst called Sabina Spielrein, Freud developed her idea of a death instinct, an inversion of the pleasure principle to procreate biologically. Freud now saw that there was a drive, a psychological drive, through which mental satisfaction could only be achieved through the destruction and death of others or ourselves. And this was because we had excessively repressed or denied pleasure in our minds. And if we keep rejecting pleasure and relationship, our libido, our life drive, turns to death, pain, and destruction for its satisfaction. This can come about through very critical parenting, critical schooling, or authority figures, or even restrictive religions and social groups. The death instinct is very close to Freud's earlier sadistic drive, but it goes further than just humiliation and pain towards a psychological object, and it moved into the psychological compulsion for death. Now, Freud doesn't talk about misogyny in any of these papers, nor does he mention racism or fascism. So I'm applying his model of mind in these texts to give us a better understanding of how we get to sadistic misogyny. So these two videos on Freud's sadistic drive are just a very introductory level of application from his 3 essays paper. I've mentioned his other papers just in case you're interested in following this up. Now, in passing, we can just say that Freud's movement across these papers also shows that there is no such thing as a singular Freudian psychoanalysis, because he developed his model of mind at least 4 times. I have a forthcoming video on that. And that makes it difficult to know which part of Freud are you actually trashing or discrediting when people attack him. Do you know which part of Freud you're disagreeing with? At the very least, you have to talk about early, middle, and late Freud, because like all scientists as well as artists, his model of mind developed with the evidence and experience he was gathering over years and in collaboration with others such as Carl Abraham and Sandor Ferenczi. So the first distinction I want to make is that between sadistic misogyny and consensual kink, or BDSM, which is bondage, domination, sadism, and masochism in sexual pleasurable activities. In consensual BDSM, where sadistic and masochistic acts of pleasure take place, there are highly organized and agreed sequences of actions with safe words to stop too much pain. The goal is to produce a specific type of sexual pleasure, and participants of BDSM actively go out and seek that type of sex where those rules are understood. So BDSM, which does involve the sadistic and masochistic drives, is a consensual sexual event that occurs in the moment. There is an excellent chapter by Rachel Ann Kieran and Elizabeth Sheff in a book that I edited and is still in print from the publisher, and that gives more detail about the difference between intimate partner violence and consensual BDSM sexuality. That book is called Critical and Experiential Dimensions in Gender and Sexual Diversity. I'll put a link in the description to this video if you're interested. Now, in contrast to consensual BDSM, sadistic misogyny is a permanent form of heterosexual interaction with women in order to subjugate women as our psychological slaves. It is not a sexual identity or orientation, but a drive based on creating pain. So this moves it towards abuse and criminal behaviours that need to be psychologically challenged because of the non-consensual harm sadistic misogyny brings to others. So, in shifting misogyny into a sadistic psychology, we are stepping away from explanations that have come from feminism, sociology, or anthropology. Feminism and sociology have looked at misogyny as male oppression in social systems, which has generally been brought under the singular term patriarchy, the rule of the father, the elder, the dominant men. It then followed that if you change the system, you can change men. Now, clearly, social systems can be changed regarding what we choose to tolerate as abusive, criminal, or violent behaviours in a society. And for feminists, change in social systems is believed to be brought about by education and laws that punish violence against women. But I have frequently repeated the phrase feminism failed to change men because this approach of cultural critique has not come close to the core of the problem in misogyny, and it hasn't even brought about adequate legal reform. Now, of course, feminists would argue that they were not trying to change men, and they were more about creating their own physical, sexual, and psychological safety, freedoms, and emancipation. So the feminist focus falls on cultural change through education as well as legal and government policy reform. Feminism can then draw on sociology to analyse structures of power. And there is an additional intersection with social anthropology. But all of this leaves the origins of misogyny and its perpetual repetition in human society unexplained and untouched at its core. If we understand sadistic misogyny as a psychological need coming from a psychological drive, then we are closer to identifying why it keeps repeating in heterosexual men for centuries and millennia. And just like racism and fascism, it never seems to go away, whatever the social or systemic changes with laws, rules, and regulations. So, early psychoanalysis has always intersected with social anthropology first, and then with cultural structures later. And you can see this in the middle and late periods of both Freud and Jung. Sadistic misogyny is one part of how heterosexual men are biopsychologically wired into a sadistic drive that gets automatically activated in the proximity of women. And that psychological activation occurs in communities and societies regardless of laws, norms, customs, and education. We just can't help it. We can suppress, repress, or push our sadistic misogyny down into our unconscious, but it is always there. And it is part of what it is to be a heterosexual man. A part that women can never understand and men's egos cannot see. because it lives in the shadow mental spaces of our unconscious. Heterosexual men have a psychological need for violence, aggression, destruction, death, and abuse. It is one part of our psychological disorder and lives in our psychological shadow space, waiting to get triggered and to erupt. Now, rushing ahead a little bit, we might want to know, what the hell do we do with our sadistic drive once we identify it and can see it operating all the time after going through our psychological reflection? And I can't give you a very detailed answer here. But generally, Freud thought that some of us had the capacity to redirect sadistic energy into something creative, a process he called sublimation. So, serving society creatively and innovatively, campaigning for social issues, finding equality with women and each other, or the production of art that brings people together in non sadistic spaces, all of these were possible outcomes of redirecting the drive. I'm not aware of any of his writings on sports, but that could be another redirection of the sadistic drive. But in psychoanalysis, no individual can naturally do any of these redirections. So the work of the therapist is to very gradually allow the client to explore their unconscious contents, identify the dominant factors as drives and psychological object relations, and then help you to mentally separate from them. Once we see our dominant drive, we then have a choice to follow it or not. And without that sight, that psychological sight, we remain victims to our unconscious contents. That psychological sight is the psychological reflection work of therapeutic analysis. And that is what I am attempting here. So let's get back to sadistic misogyny. In the original interview with Chrissy Pollard on the ITT Mind channel, Chrissy graded misogyny into behaviours on a spectrum. She started with microaggressions of sexual harassment in the workplace before moving on to domestic violence, domestic abuse, and then to the more forensic and criminal acts of rape and murder. At each point, statistics and concrete examples were given by both of us in that interview to demonstrate the sadistic drive to humiliate, physically and sexually abuse, rape, and murder women. And despite that, men in the comments kept asking for evidence, even when it was right in front of their screens. In the video on masculinity without Jung's shadow, I went into more detail about the case of Gisèle Pellicot, who had been married to her husband for over 50 years before being drugged, raped by other men, and filmed by him. All of these examples, as facts, as evidence, no matter how many times you present them to heterosexual men, cannot be mentally processed by us. And this splitting between visible facts and inability to see them is a psychological problem. And it needs a psychological modelling to understand it. When psychoanalysis talks about the conflict between the ego and the unconscious, you have a starting point for why men's cognitive egos cannot recognise or process our shadow psychology. Sadly, it takes a huge amount of personal pain or huge scales of loss, social devastation and destruction before men are willing to psychologically reflect on ourselves. To develop that just a bit more, I want to highlight two books by a feminist author called Laura Bates. And the first book is Men Who Hate Women, and the second one is called The New Age of Sexism. The first book is about the online radicalization of young white men into extreme racist misogyny, which is fixated on fantasies of sexual violence against women. And she also asks in that book why the problem of men is not dissected analytically in the media. The second book, which has just been released, looks at key forms of sexual fantasy in sadistic misogyny and researches how these sadistic fantasies of violence against women are now available in the world of AI and virtual reality or extended reality. Now, I found the titles of Laura's chapters really useful in identifying specific types of sadistic misogyny. The New Age of Slut Shaming, Deep Fakes, The New Age of Street Harassment, the Metaverse, The New Age of Rape, Sex Robots, The New Age of Objectification, Cyber Brothels, The New Age of Coercive Control, Image-Based Sexual Abuse, and the New Age of Discrimination, Designing AI. Like a lot of feminist critiques, Laura's books are a very well-researched detailing of male behaviours. But she does not identify the problem as psychological sexual fantasies of violence, where the humiliation, powerlessness, and pain of women produces a mental pleasure and a mental satisfaction in heterosexual men. She doesn't understand any of these behaviours as a sadistic drive that produces sadistic misogyny in heterosexual men. Laura also notices that sadistic misogyny, she doesn't use that term, but she notices that this type of attitude is profitable business. She says there is almost no demand from women to degrade and abuse men in the same way they routinely degrade and abuse us. So for heterosexual men who keep insisting that sadistic misogyny is not a widespread problem that is specific to us, if you follow the money, that does not appear to be the case. Sadistic misogyny is big money because there is a big demand. Laura's research finds that 143,000 videos on 40 popular websites were viewed 4.2 billion times, with these sites getting 17 million different visitors a month. So Laura is then forced to talk about the profit motive for big tech billionaires who own and control all the designing and processes of AI, and who will be exploiting any type of sexually violent gratification that brings them profits and cash. But this would not be possible if men were not psychologically structured to want that type of pleasure and mental stimulation, to feel gratified, superior and strong. And we do this through our superiority to women, which is a mentally gratifying position, and without which we are psychologically lost. Talking of AI girlfriends and sex robots, Laura says, if sex robots allow men to feel temporarily in control, the AI girlfriends let them maintain that sense of total domination and power all day, every day. Sex robots and AI girlfriends are program designed to be submissive, flattering, dehumanized, and hypersexualized. So we can clearly see here sadistic misogyny as a permanent attitude of satisfaction, as Freud called it, rather than just a temporary sexual pleasure or a temporary sexual release. Talking of Mark Zuckerberg, Laura quotes him as saying, in the metaverse, you'll be able to do almost anything you can imagine. Both Zuckerberg and Laura have no concept of a sadistic drive that metaverse fantasy will unleash in heterosexual men. So Laura is clearly surfing the fantasy needs of sadistic misogyny without understanding the psychological wave that she is skimming. Extended reality, or XR, is already creating graphic violence, sexual abuse, and virtual assault. In VR chat rooms, boys as young as 9 to 12 years old can share gang rape fantasies and become groomed into sexualized violence with ethnic supremacy content built in. There are cyber brothels in Berlin, Japan, Barcelona, Moscow, Tunisia, and Amsterdam that also have slightly underage looking girls as sex robots. Now, what I find useful about Laura's new Age of Sexism book is that she predicts a range of sadistic misogyny fantasies and actions that are already being acted out by heterosexual men. And these fantasies and these actions will now be projected into a cyberspace that will be flooded with our fantasies, just as pornography is. What she does not go into is the more criminal and forensic sadistic misogyny of rape and murder, where sex, violence, and the death of women are fused into a singular state of mind in heterosexual men. She does talk about these as rape death threats and rape death fantasies that she and other women have received. This particularly applies to any successful woman in politics or sports or business. And we can also think about countries where gender violence is normative, such as South Africa, India, Afghanistan, and where it is a cultural norm, including female genital mutilation, which is, of course, conducted by heterosexual men. But the fusion of sex and extreme violence is a mental space that, understandably, feminists should not have to enter into. It is a problem for heterosexual men. It's our problem. We are the ones living with these fantasies of sexual pleasure and the death of women. So the psychological need for the death of women after sexual intercourse with them in rape and murder is the clearest evidence that sex, pleasure, and the killing of women are psychologically fused in the sadistic misogyny of heterosexual men. Technically, it is about how the sadistic drive moves into the death instinct of middle and late Freudian texts. But the fact that the rape and murder of women is even a fantasy, let alone an act that some men get to carry out, and that is culturally accepted in some cultures, is clear evidence of a mental illness in the male brain. The mass rape of women in military wars, such as in Sudan at the moment, are facts that heterosexual men need to think about, because it has the capacity to erupt in any civilized individual as well. More disturbingly, these wars where rape and murder occur are funded by the West for the country's mineral and other resources, and often take place with Western, white, European mercenaries. So the civilized West is deeply connected to the atrocities that happen against women in these countries. I'm now going to give some examples that may upset you. So please feel free to skip forwards by about 2 minutes if you don't want to listen to the upcoming content. My interview with Chrissy Pollard was triggered by the rape and murder of Sarah Everard in Britain by a London Metropolitan Police officer called Daniel Cousins. He kidnapped her during COVID lockdown, raped and strangled her with his police belt, dumped her body but visited it twice in the space of a few hours before dawn. He then used petrol to burn her body and dumped the remains in a pond near where he lived. Meanwhile, he conducted normal activities the next day, like calling a vet about his dog. He took his wife and 2 children to the woods where he had burned Sarah's body. His normal ego functioning was completely split off from his unconscious fantasies of the rape and murder he had just committed. In Basel, in Switzerland, a Miss Switzerland finalist called Kristina Joksimovic was strangled to death by her husband. Her body parts were pureed in a blender before being dissolved in a chemical solution. At first, her husband claimed self-defense, saying she attacked him with a knife. But when he was first interviewed, he claimed that he had found her dead and then dismembered her body in the laundry room in a panic. So again, we can see the profound splitting between a normal, functioning, civilized ego in heterosexual men with its lies and incapacity for truth. And it lives alongside the extreme sadistic misogyny in the minds of heterosexual men. Now, there are thousands of incidents of sadistic misogyny that occur on a weekly and monthly basis that I could have brought in as evidence, as facts. You just need to look at or Google the news headlines under these hideous acts where sex and murder become a mental compulsion that turns into an action in heterosexual men and in teenage boys. And we never stop to think about what we are as heterosexual men, what we are capable of as heterosexual men in our actions towards women, as well as our fantasies. We feel satisfied and morally superior when we point at other men who do such things, as if we are biologically or psychologically different from them. But we're not. It would take me 2 or 3 videos to go into the psychological formation of the move from violent sexual fantasies to actual violent actions. Yeah, the move from fantasy to action. That would take a lot of explaining. For now, I just want to make absolutely clear that the sadistic drive in the psychology of heterosexual men needs to be psychologically confronted by men towards each other. All of us have the capacity for this drive to move from the thin end of microaggressions towards women all the way to the other end of physical abuse and criminal violence. I need to understand that about myself, and I need to be aware of it with other heterosexual men when I'm with them. But more importantly than just awareness, collectively, heterosexual men need to start the conversation about why we are mentally ill, why we are mentally built in this way with this psychological construct. Because we are the ones that live in it and are trapped within it. For me, that is the job of men's groups. However, like most feminists, Laura sees the solution this way. She says we need better training for police, better support for schools, better legislation of social media platforms, and better education for young people. Now, all of this is aimed at early intervention and is so obviously necessary. But these societal systems of education and law are not built to confront the psychological formation of sadistic misogyny. What is missing is the conversation with adolescent and adult men drowning in psychological inferiority, unable to contain the surges of their sadistic drive in their psychologies, and finding women as the target object of our sadistic misogyny fantasies and actions. So, what is needed is a men's movement that does not blame women for all our problems and has the psychological intelligence not to do that. Instead, we need a men's movement that wants to understand the psychology of masculinity for ourselves. We need to look at the hardcore raw data and truth about our inferiority and our drives, and how we try to compensate for them by destroying everything around us that actually supports us and supports our existence. But sadism is just one of the two drives in misogyny. My video on masochism coming up should help to give us a more complete picture of what happens when heterosexual men are in the proximity of women. And after that, it should set us up to figure out how the two drives of sadism and masochism interact with the foundational psychological inferiority of heterosexual men. At the end of the Marquis de Sade's dialogue between a priest and a dying man, the priest is persuaded to enjoy the sexual pleasures of the prostitutes that the man invited to his deathbed, because the preacher became one whom nature has corrupted, all because he had not succeeded in explaining what a corrupt nature is. It requires immense moral and mental courage and strength for heterosexual men to look at the corruption of our biological and psychological natures that results in so many devastated lives, so much destruction, so much pain, and so much death. Both Freud and Jung claimed that if we do not understand our unconscious contents, we become victims of our fate, because those psychological contents will keep repeating with greater intensity and force the more our egos pretend they are not there. So I hope these videos helps heterosexual men to start that psychological reflection of our nature and find the capacity for psychological reflection and psychological choices. Please like, share, and subscribe, and make a donation to protect the independence of this channel. See you in the next video. Thanks for listening.